This is a compressed video presentation of a conference that I presented a paper at in Prague, Czech Republic, on Don't Just Archive It. It's a paper on how to make institutional memory both usable and useful. What I wanted to present first off is a little bit of background about what got me to where I am right now. In December last year I presented a paper at a Journal of Virtual Worlds Research sponsored pre-conference event at ICES 2012, and it was in conjunction with Yeshua Sivan and his research about 3D 3C. And when you're talking about Journal of Virtual Worlds, he likes to liken it to as well being, in addition to 3D, this idea of building community, using creativity, and making it, basing it somewhat on commerce. And my ideas here were about how it would be self-funding. So that's what really started my research here. As part of the idea of a 3D, 3C, the community element of that, I build models, and that's why you see a lot of images in my presentations. The idea that models clear things up in my head, especially when you're talking about virtual institutions. You can't just leave things out there in the ether without creating some kind of model that will put them together and make sense of what you're going to do, so that when people actually belong and affiliate themselves to a virtual institution, they know where they're at. This was the model which created the idea of community. And the other thing which about this model, which is important background information, is the idea that it's non-hierarchical. So there's no gatekeepers. And we're talking here in this presentation about media and the idea that people will engage in artistic creativity and put this media together. They need to know that there's no gatekeepers, so that their creativity doesn't have that threat of being stifled by others, whether competitively speaking or judging it based on how creative or how the aesthetics that it offers. And so this idea of creating a non-hierarchical institution was very important as well. The idea that it's a virtual institution as well is very important, because the idea that you can link individuals, artists, journalists, people who are social justice advocates and social entrepreneurs throughout the world will be able to connect themselves. And that's where this idea of bringing this digital media into this concept comes in, and it's very important to understand that there's no hierarchy. So you have various cities in my model here. They're stacked together in a virtual reality institution. And then not only do you have these teams working together at a local level, but you have these teams working together at a vertical level. And that's why this modeling is so important to me. So let's talk about ideographs. When we're talking about this institutional memory, we've now talked about the institution that I'm trying to create. So let's talk about the institutional memory that will actually be the glue that holds it together. You can't have an institution unless you have a brain for the institution. A lot of the metaphors which I use are a brain metaphor. So if you build the brain, then the organism itself thrives and it's sustainable. And in order to have a virtual institution we're talking about here, we're talking about what kind of records will be inside this institutional memory. Well, those records will be ideographs. Ideographs from my life from 50 years ago. Let's just use visual ideographs. There's verbal ideographs, and all in all there's 6 genres of artistic creativity which will be in this institutional memory. But right now let's just look at pictures from my past, because my past is very important to understand how I got to where I'm at. So 50 years ago, I'm the little guy here. I come from a pretty white bread family, is what we would call it in the United States and Canada. Look at my ideographs from my life about 7 years ago. You can see I'm a family man. I've got 4 kids. Kids are fairly grown up. Now if you look at my current photo album, these are the ideographs from current part of my life. So things have changed very dramatically in the last 7 years. Ideographs are heavily laden with connotation. So if you just see these pictures, and this was a presentation that we saw earlier in the conference here at Prague, if you just look at pictures, there's a history embedded in each one of the images. I don't have to put any captions under these pictures because they're already very heavily laden with connotation, especially this one here. So yes, I am a gay man. I'm married to a black man. I come with a lot of history, and that history is actually shaping much of my work. So let's talk about now what my unit of analysis is in my current research. Why do I need digital media? Why am I so interested in digital media and creating a database for it? And and what do I want to do with it when I build it? Well, let's look at narratives as a unit of analysis. In my research, narratives become the unit of analysis, not individuals. And sustaining institutions become the independent variable, because in my research, am determining that sustaining institutions are what keep narratives alive, especially harmful narratives. And let's call the harmful narratives for this case right here an interpretive monopoly. So being gay as a lifestyle choice is an interpretive monopoly that I was raised with from the time that I have any memory at all. I was raised a Mormon, and it's an interpretive monopoly that people are not born gay. At least it was in the 1970s. And so being gay was a lifestyle choice. And so I chose not to be gay by marrying a woman and having 4 children. So that's the institution that sustained that narrative for me. So now as a PhD in public administration, I talk about policy making. And in order to understand policy making, you look at a political spectrum from left to right in this case here. On the right side in the United States especially, and I believe it's the case throughout the world, it's a homogeneous policy network. People who want things to stay the same, people who don't want anything to change, are very much, we call them conservatives, and they very much think alike, they vote alike. And on the other side we have this heterogeneous policy network, and that's what's going to be very important in this work here, and that's all I want you to see on that slide there. So my institutional memory, this virtual institution, the brain, that I've talked about earlier, is about this heterogeneous policy network, which are policy campaigns on the bottom half of the global domain. And on the top half you have this media campaign. So this paper is all about what's on the top half of here. It's about how do we record these records into this institutional memory so that the policy making and the heterogeneous policy networks down here have material to work with. We want them to have those compelling stories. Remember, we talk about ideographs being heavily laden with connotation. So here we have the domain divided in half. So we have 6 policy campaigns down here and 6 genres of artistic creativity up here. This is the digital media. So I'm going to get very simple at this point in time, and I'm going to focus very, very narrowly on one case, just one single case study, so that you understand how this digital media works. We're going to talk about something that was a spoken ideograph, so it's something I call it listening. It was also spoken at a symposium, so that helps us classify where it was. And so now we're talking about an individual media community, academically speaking. This ideograph was presented in an academic environment at a symposium, and it was a public speak. So that's how it's archived in the database. That's how that digital media becomes usable, is we archive it in a way that we can find it again. But we also archive it as to what it's speaking of. What is it speaking to? So it's talking about sexual exploitation of women. So it's a Living Women policy campaign talking about sexual exploitation of women. We're specifically going to narrow in on the virgin purity test that some cultures give to women before they have any worth, before they can feel that they have any sense of self-worth. They have to pass this purity test. And we're going to talk about abstinence only as an ideal and how it contributes to this virgin purity test. The case study that we're going to look at is the case of Elizabeth Smart, and we're going to look at it both as digital media, and we're going to look at it as a compelling narrative for social change. So let's back up a little bit and let's talk about Elizabeth Smart as an ideograph up until 1 month ago. She was kidnapped and kept for 9 months. The kidnapping took place in Salt Lake City. And here's the timeline, which is very important. She was taken on June 5th, 2002. In August of 2002, a police officer stopped her kidnapper and his wife, and she was with them. And all she had to do was say, "I'm Elizabeth Smart, please rescue me," and she would have been rescued, and she didn't. She was in captivity, she was kidnapped and not rescued again under very similar circumstances in March 2003. So the question is, up until last month, this was the ideograph that everybody remembered when they talk about Elizabeth Smart. But last month, actually just earlier this month, she gave this speech at this public address at the Johns Hopkins University, and she talked about how the Mormon teaching on sex was what contributed to her staying in captivity for that long. And so that's the ideograph that we want to talk about. I'm going to break this video now so that it's in 2 sections, and I'll continue in part 2.